Once again, a warm welcome from all of us here at Show Academy, where we are here to help you learn the skills you need to succeed today. And welcome back everyone to yet another awesome lesson, lesson 6. In today's lesson, we are going to be covering advanced front-end scripting. And essentially in this lesson, we are going to touch base with CSS, HTML, as well as JavaScript and bring everything together. And again, this is going to allow us to actually formulate the way forward when we get to our major project for the next two lessons, lesson 7 and lesson 8. Now, with that being said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Now, first of all, we are going to have a quick recap on HTML as well as CSS because these topics were covered in our previous module. Okay, now we are not going to dive in too deep with these topics, but essentially just refresh our memories in terms of how it is that CSS and HTML is used. We'll then move on to combining JavaScript with HTML and CSS, and this is going to be quite lengthy. Also keep in mind that things might look a little complex, but when we get to the practical, everything will essentially make sense to you. And then we'll be working with JavaScript event handlers, which is extremely important in the event that the user takes some sort of action on the front end and then some sort of result needs to be outputted to the screen. And then lastly, as per usual, we'll wrap things up with a practical demonstration. Excellent. Now, before we proceed with any content, there are a couple of prerequisites that you must have under your belt to proceed with this lesson. Okay, and the first is that you should have a basic understanding of HTML. You should also have a good understanding of CSS, and then lastly, basic and somewhat intermediate knowledge of JavaScript. If you are not comfortable with any of these topics, I do strongly suggest you revisit some of our previous lessons to get a good hold or grasp of these topics. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into our very first topic and have a quick recap session on bringing together HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so we can better understand how each of these stacks work together. Now, first of all, let's start off by having a bird's eye overview of how the different technology stacks come together. And what I have here is a simple diagram that shows you the full stack when it comes to web development, okay? And in our blue circle, what we have is graphics, we've got design, we've got layout, and we've got color, which is essentially floated to the left of this diagram. Okay, and then in the center we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, this is essentially the stack we've been working with throughout this course. And the reason for this is because this is front-end web development. Now, if you have a look at our last stack, which is in our pink circle, floated off to the right-hand side, we've got SQL, PHP, Node.js, as well as ASP. And this is back-end web development, something we haven't covered in this course. Now, if you sort of summarize everything I've just said now, the blue circle focuses specifically on front-end web development. Now, even though we haven't really covered graphics and design and layout and color, we've somewhat touched on these principles as we work through CSS. Okay, then lastly, the full stack, which is the full stack of web development, consists of both stacks. Okay, now that's quite important to keep in mind. Excellent. Now let's dive a little deeper and recap the different purposes behind each of the languages we've learned so far. First of all, you remember this diagram from one of our previous lessons when we started out in web development. And let's start off with HTML. Now, if we keep in mind, HTML is essentially the skeleton or the structure of our website. This is where we add all our content like our text, our lists, our navigation systems, all of those things happen in HTML. We would then add a layer of CSS, which is our presentation when it comes to our website. Okay, now CSS allows us to add colors, animations, transitions, style images, or style basically any single element that we include using HTML. We then have JavaScript, which has been the core topic as of this module, and JavaScript allows us to manipulate the behavior of our objects. Now, more on objects. And objects basically allow us to manipulate one of two things. First of all, we can manipulate the properties of an object, which is characteristics of an object, if you remember correctly. If we take a person is an object. A person has an eye color, they've got a certain style of hair, they've got a certain skin tone color. And then if we are referring to functions, which is another property or another aspect of an object, functions are behaviors of an object. Now, going back to the people example or an individual example, a person or an individual can walk, they can talk, they can jump, they can move around. And this is essentially how we treat objects. Objects have characteristics and they've got functions. Now that we've revisited these important topics, it's time to get into the code snippets of how we can actually combine JS as well as HTML and CSS to see how they work together. Now, The first thing we have to take note of here is that when we add JavaScript to HTML, there are two approaches. We can either do this internally or we can do this externally. Much like in our previous lesson when we covered CSS, we could do the same. We could either style elements internally with our HTML document, or we could create a separate CSS document and style externally. Let's have a look at how we can add JavaScript internally to an HTML document. Now what we have here is a very basic HTML document. There's not much going on here except from the title, which has a home. And this is the block of code when it comes to our HTML. Okay, this is actually the main content if we think about it. And then what we have here is this element or this tag called script with an opening tag and a closing tag. In between that, we have some JavaScript syntax, which says hello world. So what does this translate into? It basically translates into an alert. Now, and this is pretty much key when it comes to JavaScript and HTML. When using JavaScript inside an HTML document or referencing a JavaScript file inside an HTML document, you want to ensure that you add the script tag, the opening and closing tag, after the body. And the reason for this is, if this is referenced before the body even starts, the JavaScript code might not render out and the code won't work properly. Moving on, we can essentially achieve the same thing by using external JavaScript files and referencing it in our HTML document. And this is how we would go about doing that. We've got the exact same code. The only difference here is instead of adding our JavaScript code directly into our HTML document, we call the source attribute on the script element or tag, and then we create a separate main.js file. And you'll notice the UI here is pretty much Atom, right? So we create this file called main.js. We write the code, which is alert hello world, and then if we want our output to be exactly the same as previously, we get that exact same output by just slightly changing our code. And moving forward, we will always reference our JavaScript code, especially in our practicals, in a different file, and then reference that file using the script element and calling the source attribute. Why? Because this is simply just best practice. Now you might be asking yourself, how exactly can we reference HTML objects using JavaScript? Well, essentially we can use get methods to achieve this. And here are a couple of those methods. The first one being document.getElements by class name that has a parameter of a string dot inner HTML, which is a property. Now if we break this down, we've got an object, we are calling a method on that object, and then we are calling the dot inner HTML property on that method and object. Okay, we can also achieve this by the get element by ID with a parameter that also takes in a string dot inner HTML. Now these are not approaches we are going to be using because they have become obsolete. Moving on, we've also got document.querySelector, which also takes in a string .inner HTML. And this is definitely one of the approaches we will be using to get our elements in HTML. And then lastly, document.querySelectorAll, which takes in a string parameter. Okay, now throughout this lesson, we'll be referencing the last two and we'll be working quite extensively with these two methods. So let's take a look at the first example of query selector. Now to get the text of an HTML text element, we append the .inner HTML property to the end of a get method. Our get method here being query selector, and this is how we retrieve the value of the inner HTML or of that HTML element. So let's take a look at an example. First of all, we have a very basic code snippet here, which is sort of taken out of a broader HTML document, and we have a body with a paragraph tag with an ID a-text. We've got a class which equals text, and then this text is simply just something that says this is a text. We also have our script at the bottom. Now let's run through this. First of all, we are going to reference the class in this example, and the value that we are trying to retrieve is this is a text. Okay, now let's have a look at our JS code. We create a variable first of all called myTextID, which equals document.querySelector. Now take note here, the parameter that we are passing in is actually a string value that says .text. If you remember correctly, in CSS, when we reference any class, we reference it using full stop, whatever the name is of that class. Okay, and then essentially we just alert that to the screen, and we concatenate that with using query selector, and our output when we alert is this is a text using query selector. Wonderful. Now we can achieve the same thing by using the ID as a reference, and essentially we just call the .innerHTML property on a get method like the query selected before to get its value. And here is the exact same example where we have an ID of a-text, we've got a class called text, and the value of this paragraph tag is this is a text. We then attach our main.js at the bottom, but now we are actually going to reference this ID instead of the class name. So in our JavaScript code, the only difference here is that instead of calling .text, we are calling hashtag a-text. And again, if you remember correctly, whenever we reference an ID, not a class, in our CSS code, we would use a hashtag in the beginning of our string or our ID that we are calling. And then essentially we call the .innerHTML on that. And then we alert this to the screen, and what we get is pretty much the same thing. This is a text using query selector. Now you might be wondering what happens in the event that we were working with more complex elements such as lists. Well, the same principle remains. The only difference is when we query these kind of objects, they will slightly vary. Now in this example over here, we have an unordered list with a class of myList, and in this list we've got 4 items. So we've got 4 list items, each with a specific name, item 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we've got our JavaScript code over here, which in this event, we are actually setting the var x equal to the document.query selector all. Now here we are actually using query selector all and not just query selector. And the parameter we pass in is the actual list and not even the class, just the list itself. Now to get the output, we would then alert it like we would alert an index in an array. So we would call x, get the first index, get the second index, the third index, and the fourth index. Okay, this should make sense if you understand how arrays work. Essentially, we could even use a loop to loop through each of these elements to actually get the value. We could even do interesting things like working with nested elements, and in this example we target all the paragraph elements or tags that have a div container as a parent. So essentially the paragraph tag sits inside of the div container. Let's have a look at a code example. So in this example, we've got a div container with a paragraph tag that simply reads I am paragraph 1 and I belong to the first div container. Likewise, we have a paragraph 2 and a second div container, and then lastly we have another div container with I am paragraph 3 and I belong to the third div container. Now let's assess the JavaScript code. In this example, we pretty much do the same thing. We set the variable x. The only difference here is that document.querySelectorAll calls div space p. We are not targeting the div container. Essentially, we are targeting the paragraph tag inside of the different div containers. And then we could also loop if we wanted to, but we would just call that index, the first one being 0, the second one being 1, and the second one being 2, or the value being the first value, the second value, and the third value inside of our array object. Now, as you can see, there is just so much that we can do with JavaScript. We could even take it a step further and retrieve the IDs of the elements that we create in our HTML document. To do this, we simply just append the .id property to get methods. Let's see an example in action. And in our code snippet here, we've pretty much got a very similar example to the previous one where we have an unordered list with 4 list items. And the idea here is to retrieve the ID, the list ID. So how do we do this? Let's have a look at our JavaScript code. First, we create a variable called x. We then set this equal to document.querySelector. The only difference here is when calling the UL element, instead of calling inner HTML, we are actually calling the .id property. We then alert that to the screen to actually get the ID, which says to us list ID. Fantastic. Now let's have a look at how we can retrieve the class. Now to retrieve the class, the principle again remains the same. The only difference here is that the different property we append is the .className property to a get method. And here we've got pretty much the exact same code with a class of myList. We then use our JavaScript by setting a variable x, document.querySelector on that unordered list, and then we call the class name, the .className property. If we alert this to the screen, essentially we get myList. Much like we can grab elements and values from HTML tags, we can also update the values of our elements. To do this, we use the assign operator, and if you remember correctly, in JavaScript, this just means we assign a value. To do this, we call the .innerHTML property on the get method and then set this equal to a new value. Once again, let's have a look at an example. In our code snippet over here, we've got very basic HTML content, and we've got a paragraph tag with an ID of myTextID. a class of my text class name and just a text that says I am the old text. And this is the text we're going to be updating. In our JavaScript code, what we're essentially doing is we are setting the inner HTML to a new value. But first we reference the ID, which is my text ID dot inner HTML, which is the property. We then set this to the new value. I am the new text. And that updated value gives us this output. I am the new text. Now, much like we can update values or retrieve values as well as HTML elements, we can also create new elements from scratch. And we can do this by using three methods. First, we have the create element method, which simply just creates the element that we actually want to add to our web page. And this could be a paragraph tag, it could be an image, you name it. We also have create text node, and this is specifically used for paragraphs or any sort of element that uses text values. And what we do here with this method is that we assign a specific value to any sort of text node that we want to add at a later stage. And then we call the append child method. And the append child method simply allows us to embed our element into our web page. Now let's have a look at a code example over here. Now, in our example over here, we've got both our HTML code as well as our JavaScript code. In our HTML code, we actually embed a paragraph tag that reads, I am a paragraph and I was added using HTML. Now, if we move over to our JavaScript code, we actually creating this new variable called new para for new paragraph. We then call the document.create element and pass a string of p, and this line of code just creates a new paragraph element in JavaScript. We then create another new variable called node and call the create text node on the document and pass a value. I am a paragraph and I was added using JavaScript. After which we call the append child method on the node that we just created earlier. And then in this line of code, essentially what's happening is we're creating a new value and we are just grabbing the container that already exists in our HTML code with a value or an ID of container. And then we append the node that we just created, the new pattern. We append that to the container that we just grabbed. And this is what our output looks like. And what we see here is that we can distinguish between two paragraphs, one that was created using HTML and one that was created using JavaScript. Now let's have a look at a more complex example, or let's actually look at an example where we expand on our code. And here we essentially have the exact same code. The only difference here is that we've added a new block of code in our JavaScript. And what's happening here is that we create a variable called new image. We call the document.create element and pass image, a string image, as our parameter over here. So essentially we, instead of creating a paragraph tag, we are now creating an image tag. We then call the source attribute on the new image we created and supply the actual path of the image. In this case, user.png. That's the image that's going to be displayed. And then we create another variable called image source. We call the document query selector on the body of our HTML page, so the entire body of the web page itself, and then append that image and pass the new image parameter. And here's what our output looks like. So now what we've done is we've added an image at the bottom of the paragraphs that we created earlier. Now, with all things being equal where our HTML code is concerned, what happens in the event that we actually want to insert an element before any given element? Well, here's an example of that. And in this example, it's the exact same code. The only difference here is we've got a new block of code at the bottom where we created a new paragraph of new para 2, which is a p element, which is a paragraph tag, of course. We created this variable called node2 and then created a text node with a value of I am a paragraph and I was added before the div container below me. We then append that element, that node that we just created, to the paragraph element we created, and then we call the document.body.insert before method. Now, in this case, new para2 is the actual text that's going to come before the container, and the second parameter over here for this method is the element, which is the container. Okay, and this is what the output looks like. What we see here is that the paragraph we just created is not being semantically formatted as per the normal standards with HTML. We're actually placing it prior to another element. Okay, so let's have a quick chat about updating the attributes of our elements. Now, to update the attribute of any existing element, and remember, an attribute is a property or characteristic of any given element, we need to call the .set attribute method, and this method requires two parameters: the actual attribute that you want to update and the new value. So in our example over here, we've got an input field, we've got another input field, and then we've got another input field, but this one is actually a button, where the first two is kind of your text-based input field. So In our JavaScript code, what's happening is that we call the button, we grab it via the ID, we then set the first attribute, the name of the button, to hello button, we set the second attribute to disabled, and we actually give it a Boolean value of true. We then call the username, or we create a variable username and grab the username field that we also have, or our input field, and then we set the attribute, the placeholder attribute of that username, to enter username here. And this is what the code looks like. First of all, our username over here, we can see the value here has changed in terms of the placeholder. So we don't necessarily see the name of the button that we changed to hello button because it's not visible on the front end, but we do note that the submit button has now been disabled because we set that value to true. Excellent. Now let's actually turn our attention to changing our CSS code and not our HTML code using JavaScript. And we can do this by calling the .style property, or we can call the .css text property. There is a big difference between the two, and one has a bit more flexibility over the other. So let's have a look at what the two actually achieve. Now let's actually proceed with the .style property first. Here we've got just some basic HTML code, and then here we've got our JavaScript code, and in our JavaScript code we created variables and we sort of grabbed every single element and assigned it to those variables. In this case, container, header, image, and paragraph. And this is what the actual final output looks like after running all of this code. But let's work through it together. In this block of code, essentially what we're doing is we're calling the .style property, and then we're calling the .background, and likewise the width, the opacity, the border style. All of these properties are an extension of the .style property on the container, and then we set the values. Okay. Next, we target the header, where we set the color to blue, and we set the font family to fantasy. Likewise, with the image, we set several parameters as well. And then lastly, we actually style the two paragraph tags by calling the background color. Now, the issue with this is you would actually have to go and write out each line of code to manipulate the various parameters. There's an easy way to do this with the CSS text property. Now with the CSS text property, we can achieve the exact same thing. Now consider our previous output, and essentially we've got our JavaScript code where we created our variables and assigned our container, our header, our image, and paragraph. You'll notice here though that the difference is that apart from this block of code that's exactly the same to the previous one, we've got this thing called container.style.css text, and something looks quite familiar here. You can actually see the string that we are assigning here is actually very much like we would find in a CSS style sheet. The only difference and the most important thing here is that if we use this approach, we need to ensure that we are sort of writing CSS code inside of our values that we are assigning. And that's with the container, with the header, the image, as well as the paragraphs. And as mentioned before, we'll get the exact same output, and this just looks a lot cleaner than several lines of code. Now, before we dive into our practical demonstration during the session, let's cover one last core topic: JavaScript event handlers. Now, what exactly are event handlers in JavaScript? Well, it's kind of self-explanatory. JavaScript's interaction with HTML is handled through things called events, and this usually happens when the user either manipulates the browser or elements are changed. When the page loads, for example, this is called an event. When the user clicks a button, this is also an event. And when a user does any sort of interaction on the website, this can be categorized as an event. Now, as developers, we can use these events to execute JavaScript code responses, which cause elements to be updated. Let's take a look at some of the events that we can actually use in JavaScript. First, we have the user interface type of events. We also have events that allow us to focus on whether some element is focused on or blurred out. We can use mouse clicks as events. We can even use keyboard buttons as events. And lastly, forms is just another example. Now, there are a ton out there, but for the sake of the practical over here, we are only going to be focusing on certain events. Excellent. Now, there are two ways we can actually handle or call events in JavaScript. The first is by calling those events inside of our HTML script, or we can do so using a separate JavaScript document. And the latter is always the best moving forward, and this is how we tend to do it in industry. Now, in our very first example over here, what we have is a JavaScript file. We also have an HTML document at the very top. Now, let's actually have a look at how we can handle events directly in HTML. In the case over here, this is what our output would look like. Okay, so in this ID that we have here called the uname field, we are basically referencing this element, this input element. We are also referencing a different input element with an ID of submit button. So we bring these elements into our JavaScript, we reference them using the query selector, method, and then we specify the IDs as parameters. Okay, after this we create a function called edit form uname, and then we essentially just style this with a different background color. We've got a separate function here called submit me, and now let's actually have a look at how we can call these events in HTML. So in the first example over here, we call the onFocus event. So once a user focuses on a specific element, in this case the input field, this event is then called in HTML by simply saying onFocus and then passing in that event edit form uname. In the second case, we do exactly the same thing, but the event we are calling here is onClick. Okay, so not on focus. So when the user clicks a button, this function is called submit me, and then this is what the output looks like. So you'll notice that in the first case, or the first event that we called, the background color of our input field is green. And when you click the submit button, then you actually get this pop up over here. This is the two different kind of events that we can call, or just examples of events on focus and on click. Now let's actually have a look at how we can handle events in JavaScript. So in this example, we've got our HTML code at the top. In the center, we've got our JavaScript code, and then the output, or the current state of our output, right at the bottom, which basically says try saying hello, click the button below to change this text. Now once the user clicks this button, the text should change. So let's have a look at the code quickly. What we're doing is, again, we are bringing in a text field and a button into our JavaScript by calling the query selector method. Okay, so we are just referencing those elements. Then we create a function that says hello, and all this function does is takes the text that's in HTML, the one that says click the button below to change this text, and it changes that text to hello world. So here is where the event actually occurs. We actually say the button that we referenced earlier, call the onClick event or the property on this button and set this equal to say hello, which is our function. And this is the output that we get at the bottom. So when the user actually clicks this button, the text updates. So you might be wondering what happens in the event, excuse the pun, that you actually would like to have two things happen at the same time by just clicking one button. This requires us to attach two events to a single item, which is not necessarily that straightforward. Let's have a look at an example. So over here, we've got the exact same code. The only difference here is we've got the say hello function as before. We've also got a second function. And now what we want to do is we want to increase the font size of the text as well. So the text that says hello world needs to be increased and not just changed. So here we call the button, we call the onClick property, and we set those events equal to that property. But notice something here. You'll see that the text is not changing to hello world. The only thing that's happening is the increase font size function is being called. So why is this the case, and how do we get around it? Now, unfortunately, when it comes to calling the onClick property or any event on an element, if we have multiple functions or events being called on that element, the last one is the only one that's going to be called. Like we saw in the example previously, only the increase font size function was called. Now here we have the exact same code with the two functions we created earlier. We also have this third function that we created. Now this function is called do two things, and essentially all this function does is it calls the previous two functions that we created earlier in a single function. And then we reference that button, call the onClick property, and then we actually set the function equal to do two things. So now we'll notice in our output that the font size has increased and the text has actually changed to hello world. So this is just a quick workaround when working with multiple events on a single element. Excellent. Now there are other workarounds such as event listeners. Now in JavaScript, event listeners are just like event handlers. The only difference is you can attach as many event listeners to a single element as much as you basically want. Okay, so here we've got two examples of code again, our HTML code and our JavaScript code. In our HTML code, we've got a simple container with an ID, or div container with an ID of container. We've got a button inside of that container with an ID of my button that simply just says click me. Now let's jump over to our JavaScript code. Here we simply define a function that says say hello, and this function is just going to throw a pop-up or an alert that says hi, how are you doing? So to call this event or to use an event listener, we simply just reference the button that we pulled into JavaScript and call the add event listener method. Now this method requires two parameters. In this case, the click and say hello. The click being the actual event when the user clicks with a button, and then the actual function you want to be passed when this event occurs. And our output at the bottom shows us that when the user clicks this button, we'll get this pop-up that says, hi, how are you doing? Now earlier we did mention that one advantage of using event listeners over handlers is that we overcome that issue we were experiencing earlier, where event handlers only allows you to specify one function or event for an element. So let's have a look at how all of this plays out. Here we've got three functions. A function that says say hello, which is just an alert. A function called set hover color, which just changes the background color of an element, in this case a button. And then a function called set normal color, and this just reverts that button back to its normal color. So here we've got three lines of code where we're calling the add event listener 3 times on the same element, the button. In the first case, on click say hello. This is the function being called. In the second case, we've got mouse over, which is just when the user hovers over the button, then call the set hover color function. And then lastly, we've got our last event over here, which is mouse out. That just means when the user is no longer hovering or focusing on that button, set the button back to its original color. And we'll see the output at the bottom. We can actually see that when hovering over, the button turns to this red color. We also get this alert at the same time. Unfortunately, you don't see that third event come through over here because the button has been hovered over. Now, one thing we haven't spoken about yet is how do we pass parameters through event listeners and handlers? The issue with this is that you can't just do it without this thing called an anonymous function, because the moment you do that, the code gets executed automatically, and that's not always ideal. Now, what exactly is an anonymous function? So here we've got 2 blocks of code, our HTML at the top and our JavaScript at the bottom. In our HTML code, we simply have a div container. We've got a paragraph element with a text or an ID of my text, and then a button with an ID of button. So in our JavaScript code, we then reference all those elements. We create a function called update text, and this function, you'll notice here, has a parameter called new text. And then essentially all this does is it just updates the text based on the parameter that the user passed in. Now, when we call the add event listener method on the button that we created in our HTML code, we call it on the click event. So on click, then call this anonymous function. Now, what you'll see here is that this function does not have a name. This is called an anonymous function, and this is how we get around passing parameters. So we create a function, and this function simply calls the previous function that we created, and then we are actually able to pass in that parameter. In this case, a string that says I've been updated on click. And this is what the output looks like once the user actually clicks that button. Wonderful. And now for that part of the lesson that I know most of you have really been looking forward to, our practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's code. Now, before we dive into the code, let's have a look at what we're going to be working towards. And essentially, it's just this very basic login page for this company called MobiWash, where theoretically speaking, you could order a car wash online. And you'll notice there's a couple of animations and transitions that take place. But what we really want to get to is the meat of this. So if I had to go and type in something like user and the incorrect password, and I click login, I will then get this modal that pops up, and then it prompts me to try again in the event that my username or password is incorrect. And then if I actually go and punch in the correct details, we'll notice that I was able to successfully log in. Okay, and then this redirects me to a new page. So let's dive in. Now, as per usual, I'll be working out of my folder called L6, and this is where all my content has been saved. Now, in this demo, I've already completed all the HTML code as well as the CSS code. The reason for this is because I really just want to focus on the JavaScript over here. And keep in mind, if you do want access to all of these resources, or specifically the source code, then you can access them via the summary notes. So this is our HTML boilerplate for that login page that we saw initially. Then we've got the index page, and this is where we get redirected to once we log in successfully. Let's just run through the login page for a second. So we've got a heading of login at the top. We've got a form embedded over here, and then we've got 2 classes. This is actually buttons. Okay, keep that in mind. And then we've got that modal page, which is that pop-up page. And then if we take note of our JavaScript, we currently have nothing. So this is where we're going to be scripting our JS code. And then as we peruse the resources, we've got 3 images over here as well. These images won't necessarily always display in Atom depending on the format, but these seem to be working just fine. And then lastly, we have our style sheet over here, which has been prepped for you. And again, all of the source code is available in your summary notes. Now let's have a look at what we currently have. So this is what the output currently looks like. Okay, for the most part, it looks very similar, but the modal page needs to be invisible only until the user enters the incorrect details. Okay, so let's start scripting out our JavaScript code. Now that we are back in Atom, I can start writing out my code. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hide that modal by default. So I'll create a variable called modal. I'll set this equal to document.query selector, and then I will pass in the necessary parameter here, which is the class modal. Okay, so I'll say dot modal, and where am I getting this from? My HTML code. Okay, so if I head back to my login page, I'll see that I've got this thing called modal at the bottom over here. Okay, so I'm referencing this object, that pop-up. So I'm going to set this modal to be invisible by calling the style property on it, and then I'll say display, and then I'll set this equal to none. Okay, let's just add a semicolon, save this up, and see what we have so far. So I head back over and I refresh. My modal is now gone. Perfect. So I can start working on this environment over here and this UI over here before I can do anything else. Great stuff. So let's head back over to Atom. And now what I'll do is I'll work on my login form. Okay, so I need to grab that login form first of all by saying login form. I'm creating a variable here to actually hold this form. I'll say document dot query selector, and then I will pass the login form's ID as a parameter over here. So don't forget your quotation marks. I'll say hashtag, and then I'll call that login form on its ID. So login dash form. Okay, let's save that. Again, where am I grabbing this login form from? My HTML code. And if we scroll to the top over here, this is the form that I'm grabbing, okay? Because I want to do some sort of JS code on this. So the first thing I want to do is when it comes to forms and you hit the submit button, by default, your page will refresh. And this is what we want to avoid. So I'm going to create a function over here. I'm going to call the login form. I'm going to add the event listener method. And I'm going to call this on the submit action. When submitting, pass in this anonymous function. Okay, and all this function does is just prevent the default behavior, and this function requires a parameter of E. Now I'll just put this on the next line so it looks a lot more readable. I will then call the prevent default method on this submit function. Okay, there we go. And if I save this, everything should be just fine. This is not something we can necessarily test. Okay, so moving over to the next line, I will now actually create the function to validate that login, and this is going to be the most important block in this script. So pay very, very careful attention. So I'm simply going to start off by creating the function by calling the function keyword. I will then call this function validate login. Okay, this function doesn't take in any parameters. And then what I want to do is I want to grab the fields, the username and the password field from our form. So I'll go ahead and call this uname field, which is equal to, I'll just copy and paste my document query selector over here. And then I'll edit this. And this is also an ID, so I'll just say uname. Where am I grabbing this from? My form. So this is what I'm trying to grab over here. Okay, and then I'm also trying to grab the password field. So I'll just copy and paste this. Remember, reusable code is really, really awesome. And I'll simply call this pwd for password field, and I'll alter this and call this password. Okay, so now that we've grabbed those elements from our form, we can configure our logic. So I'm going to create a conditional statement here. Okay, and for this conditional statement, if the username dot value, okay, this is whatever the value the user is going to punch in, is not equal to admin and another condition, so both these conditions must be met. Okay, so and if pw field or pwd field dot value is also not equal to 1 2 3 4 5 6, then do this: grab that modal, the modal that's going to be the pop-up of course, and then set the style on this modal to display which is equal to block. And then I'll just end this off over here and I'll save this. Now, else if the opposite is the case, then do this. So else if, let's just give this some space, else if the username dot value is equal to admin and the password is correct, so and this needs to be outside of my quotation marks, and if the password field dot value is equal to the correct number 1 2 3 4 5 6, then redirect the user to the actual window, okay, or the next page. So I'm going to call the window object here. I'm going to say dot location, which is just where you want the page to open, dot href, which is equal to my index dot html page, okay, and then also alert. So maybe just throw that alert up, alert you are now logged in. Let's actually review the function. So in our function over here, let's just open this up. In our function over here, we've given it a function name of validate login. We've grabbed the fields that we want to work with, and then we said if the username value is not equal to admin and the password is not equal to 1 2 3 4 5 6, then throw up that block, that modal block, okay, and ask the user to try again. Else if they got everything correct and they passed in the correct details, then alert to the screen that they are now logged in, and then run this last bit of line of code over here, which redirects them to that index page. Now this index.html page is this page over here, okay. So let's save this and see how our functionality is working thus far. So I'll just refresh this and I'll go admin, punch in the wrong password, and then I have this error. Now the issue here is we need to dismiss this modal so that the user can go back to the UI behind it and try again. Let's refresh this, make sure the alternative is working correctly, 1 2 3 4 5 6, and there you go. You are now logged in and I'm redirected successfully to the page. Okay, let's go back, let's refresh this and jump back into Atom. Now to get started on that last bit of code, I need to navigate back to my main.js file. And keep in mind, my main.js file is actually linked to my HTML over here. This is how I link my JavaScript and my HTML document together, by using the script element, specifying the source, and then specifying the document. So that last bit of code we need to run, let's just make sure this is our function ends there. We need to create another function. So I'm going to say function dismiss modal, and now I'm simply just going to say when the user clicks on that button, then dismiss the modal. So I'll say style dot display, and then I'll set this equal to none again. Wonderful. Now we need to call this function somewhere, and we can do it here with an event handler or an event listener, but let's be flexible and sort of practice everything we've learned so far. So I'm just going to head back over to my index page, or actually my login page, and what I want you to take note of is that I've already called the function over here. Remember I said that I've built the boilerplate out for you, much like with the validate login function. Instead of calling it over here, instead of calling this function in JavaScript with an event handler or listener, I've called it on the onClick attribute over here, and I've set the validate login function to be activated, if you will, when the user clicks that button. Okay, and likewise with the dismissal of the modal, the same happens. When the user clicks on that try again button, then this function is called onClick. Okay, so let's actually see all of this in action. So I'll just save all my code, make sure everything is running just fine. I'll navigate back, I'll refresh this, I'll punch in hello and some sort of garbage password, click login, and if I click try again, that now disappears. Let's try the alternative again, just to make sure everything is working just fine. And then password 1 2 3 4 5 6, login. Great, everything works just fine. Now, I hope this was a really useful practical for you. In our next session, we're actually going to be working towards a very big project. So I do want to encourage you to attend our last 2 sessions.